Hey everyone, you're watching the Esperanza 243. Sorry if I started off a little mid-sentence. I try to start my vlogs, I try to start my book readings with the screen off because I really don't like seeing that glare on my glasses. Alright, book reading. Let's get to it, shall we? Miss Tatum, sorry. Miss Tatum had a curious look on her face. You say your last name is O'Connell? You say your last name is O'Connell. Is that your mother's maiden name? Garnett shook her head. No, it's not. My mother's maiden name is Tarleton. She paused. But if she didn't die and she's around here somewhere, she probably would have changed her last name. You're probably right, she replied. She cast her head aside. Her eyes were blank and looking forward. The next second, she shook her head. She looked worried. You two better be careful. The king is going to be mighty disappointed. Mr. Ewald widened his eyes. His Majesty, he muttered. He looked at Garnett. We ought to go, Miss Garnett. Now that you're here, word must have spread. He'll be wanting to see you right away. Garnett took a deep breath and let it out. Oh boy. And I know more than he does of what happened that night, she whispered, almost loud enough for them to hear. Don't worry, Miss Garnett, he said. He swam to the door of Miss Tatum's cove. Come along now. We must be going. She nodded. She looked at Miss Tatum and smiled. I'll come back, Miss Darla, she told her. She swam to the door with her bucket as she waved to her. It was nice meeting you. It was nice meeting you, dear, she called as the two mer people left. Mr. Ewald and Garnett were in the throne room of the underwater castle. They were waiting for the king. She was messing with her fingers, almost wringing them. He noticed that and smiled softly. He put his hand on her shoulder. She looked at him. It's all right to be nervous, he whispered. The properness in his voice started to disappear. It's your first time meeting him, being an Aquatica. She noticed the change and gave him a weak smile. A weak smile. I'm sorry, she said. I guess I am a bit nervous. Suddenly, someone was entering the throne room. They turned toward the merperson. The merman was big and muscular. He had golden gray hair and wore a gold crown on his head. Mr. Ezra and Garnett bowed as he swam to his throne and sat down. Your Majesty, Mr. Ezra said. Garnett echoed his words. Greetings, Ezra. What brings you here? And who's this fine mer-lady? He asked. They rose from their bow. Your Majesty, this is Miss Garnett O'Connell. She is the person who turned into a mermaid recently. The king held his hand up. He rose from his throne and circled around her slowly. She slightly bowed her head. "Your Majesty," she said politely, as his eyes met hers. He smiled politely. "I can see you are a descendant of one. Not many humans have... Sorry. I can see you are a descendant of one. Not many humans have two different natural hair colors. Who is your mother, dear one?" "Her name is Amber Tarleton. My aunt has told me she died when I was a baby." She stopped herself from saying that she didn't believe it. "You were raised by your aunt, then?" She nodded. "Did she tell you anything else?" "Yes, she did." He raised a brow. "What did she tell you?" She sighed. "She told me I was a lot like her. My mother saw the ocean once, but never got in. When they were kids, my mom kept having nightmares of the same thing." She paused. "When my aunt explained the nightmare, it sounded more like a memory. I never figured out why until today." The king looked curious. "How did you figure it out? Was it a memory?" Your Majesty, if I may," Mr. Ezra interrupted. The king looked at him and nodded. "Speak your mind, Ezra." Mr. Ezra hesitated. "I took her to see Miss Darla, the psychic one." "You did you?" He gave him a curious look. "What happened?" "Miss Garnett fell asleep soon after looking at the walls. That's happened before with other mermaids and mermen." He paused. Miss Darla said she had to be awakened. If there were other fears she had besides ours, it would have hurt her, possibly killed her." Garnett gasped. She covered her mouth when the king looked at her. He looked at Mr. Ezra. "Go on, Ezra." "It seems the walls caused her to live through the entirety of this nightmare she was talking about just now." The king widened his eyes and looked at Garnett. "Miss Garnett, is it?" "Miss Garnett, is it?" She nodded. "Is this how you discovered the nightmare as a memory?" She nodded again. He paused, looking her in the eyes. "Explain this nightmare as you experienced it." "Yes, Your Majesty," she said, bowing her head. She described the nightmare memory as best as she could. She was full nervous when she was describing him and what was going on between him and Corinna. When she was done, he and Mr. Ezra's eyes were wide. The next second, the king slowly swam to his throne and sat down. He thought for a while. Then he covered his face with his hands and closed his eyes. He sighed nervously and worriedly. His whole body nearly shook from his sigh. Garnett hesitated, wondering whether she should go to him or not. I don't care. If he's my great-uncle or great-great-uncle, I should be there for him, she thought to herself. She took a deep breath and let it out. Then she swam to the king's side. Your Majesty, are you all right? He sighed nervously again. His body shook. Do you know who this mermaid is? He whispered. She bit her lip. She would be your niece, sir. Since part of the dream was my mother's dream, I'm surprised I didn't get it. She paused. I did say I could barely hear what you said when you called to her. If I'm correct, it sounded like Arena. He shook his head. That's not her name, he whispered. It was Karina. It was quiet. I was very fond of her. We had fun times. I'm sorry, Your Majesty. It sounded like he grunted, but it was a short, muffled laugh. Considering she is part of your ancestral root, I think it would be best if you called me Uncle Adelaide. She hesitated. Hearing that made her unsure if that was correct. For all we know, that memory is the only proof we have that is connected to him. But is it really connected to me and my family? She thought to herself. She sighed. The only way to find out is to find other descendants of the king's siblings. Yes, sir. Uncle, she whispered. She swam out of the room toward Virginia Beach. Mr. Ezra followed her. Miss Garnett, wait! He called out. She heard him and stopped. They were at the entrance to the castle. She sighed. He stopped beside her. Are you all right? I'm fine, she whispered. I don't think the king is. He's probably crying by now. He shook his head. Don't think that, he said. The properness in his voice was now gone. He just found out that the mermaid was his niece. I am sure he is in pain because he turned her human. He touched her shoulder. It's not your fault. She looked him in the eyes. It might be my fault. If it's all true, I'm his great-great-grandniece, she hissed. Or whatever. Oh, sorry, let me try that again. It might be my fault. If it's all true, I'm his great-great-grandniece, she hissed. Or whatever. She swam away. He followed her again. What do you mean, if it's all true? Do you think this memory isn't from your family's ancestor? He was shocked to hear that from her. She stopped swimming. Tears began to fill her eyes. I don't know. She paused. I'm sure it is. I just don't want to believe it. After meeting him. Mr. Ezra nearly gasped. Garnett, that is not nice. What will change your mind? Is there anything that will get you to believe you belong here? She looked down. He lifted her chin. You're a nice woman, Miss Garnett. Whether you're a mermaid or not, you should be following your heart. She smiled weakly. And I am going to stop. Alright, everyone. I'll talk to you later. This is the Esperanza 243 signing off.